In this mini lecture, I'm going to talk about the shift from borderlands to border. Living here in El Paso and Juarez, we know we are on the border. People remind us all the time, whether it's the Border Patrol or whether it is news articles about how terrible the border is, or whether it is us enjoying border culture, or crossing from Juarez to El Paso to go shopping, or crossing from El Paso to Juarez to buy medicine. We know that we are on the border. The title of this mini lecture is From Borderlands to Border. So what are borderlands? Borderlands are more of an amorphous, undefined territory where people come together both to trade, but also in violence. Sometimes we hear, especially about the Spanish colonial period or the period when the United States was moving westward, that there was a clash of cultures. So I don't want us to think about clashes of culture. I want us to think about people trying to take over territory, people using military strength, using demographics, populating places in order to take over territory. But borderlands are also places where cultures can mix together to create something new. Borderlands are something that can be very contested because they're not an actual borderline. So there is a movement in the history of the United States and Mexico that goes from borderlands to an actual borderline. And we're going to talk about when that happened and how that happened. So how do we end up with the actual borderline that we have now? It's a long process, beginning with the Texas annexation by the United States in 1845. By 1845, Texas had been functioning as an independent republic for 9 years, and the U.S. kept saying, no, we're not going to annex it, but it finally did in 1845, and it claimed the boundary as the Rio Grande. The historic boundary of Texas was not the Rio Grande, it was the Nueces River. So in 1846, with Mexico viewing the annexation of Texas as an act of war by the United States against Mexico, conflict begins in this strip of land between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. Because of this conflict, the United States declares war against Mexico, and the war lasts from 1846 through 1847. A treaty is signed in 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends up transferring about half of Mexico, if you include Texas, half of Mexico to the United States. And that creates a new boundary line because now not only is Texas part of the United States, but New Mexico is, Arizona is, California is, Colorado, Nevada, part of Utah. So this huge territory is then suddenly in the United States. Move forward to 1853. The Gadsden Purchase, or in Spanish it's called El Tratado de Mesía, shifts land from Mexico to the United States through purchase. So this is not through war, it's not through the military, it's through a treaty between the two countries. So that part of southern New Mexico and southern Arizona is sold by Mexico to the United States. And finally, the last piece that creates the borderline that we know today is the Chamizal Treaty of 1964. I've told you before that the river shifts a lot. So one of the terrible things that happened in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is that the treaty put the river as the boundary between the two nations. But if you have a river that's moving, and then you say that's the boundary, you know it's going to have problems. And it does, it has problems because it keeps shifting. Well, after negotiating for a century, the United States and Mexico finally decided about the transfer of property around the Chamizal, and that concludes the creation of the boundary line that we know today. Everything that I just told you about the creation of the borderline, which included wars and treaties, is part of this process of border making. And living here on the border, even if we don't know the academic term border making, we know how these things occur. So you have war and you have treaties create the borderline. But there's other ways that create or strengthen or reinforce borders. So you have, for example, let me give you a current example. The border fence that was built about a decade ago that you can see if you're driving on Paisano or if you're driving on the border highway. The border wall that was such a big part of the presidential campaign of 2016 and continues. So physically stopping people from crossing back and forth is part of border making. Legislation is part of border making. So if you have immigration laws that say, in order to come into this country, you need X, Y, and Z, that's part of border making. Let me give you an example. In 1917, there was an immigration law passed, and the purpose of this Immigration Act was actually to keep out poor Europeans who were coming to the United States from Europe. It's at the end of World War I. But it had the effect of keeping out poor people in general. So the 1917 Immigration Act called for a literacy test, and it called for a head tax that each adult would have to pay of $8, which was a ton of money for poor people in 1917. So that made it more difficult to cross the border. So again, it's part of border making. First, you agree on the border line, then you begin to manage who can cross the border and how people can cross the border. Here you see an image of the international bridge between the two cities. I want to give you an example of how the initial creation of the border in 1848 influences the region that we live in. So in 1848, as I said a second ago, the United States and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and create this borderline that is the Rio Grande in this part. I told you that somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people literally found themselves shifted from Mexico to the United States. There is this idea that comes out of the Chicano civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s that says, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's exactly what happened. So imagine these tens of thousands of people who didn't migrate to the United States. The United States took the territory that they were living on, often for generations, And suddenly they were in another country that spoke a different language, that was very anti-Catholic, that had a different judicial system, and that had different legislation, and a country that viewed them as not equal citizens. So that's a whole other lecture that I could give about how that happened. But just so you know, that there were many people that did not want to be in the United States because they didn't think their futures would be very stable in the United States. So the Mexican government took part of the money from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and they started a repatriation program. So repatriation is when you return to your homeland. Right? Patria means homelands. Repatriation, returning to your homeland. And with this money, they asked Father Ramon Ortiz, who was the priest in Juarez, to travel throughout New Mexico. If you want to move across the new border in order to remain in Mexico, we will help you. So there's 2 towns in our region that are founded by people who don't want to be in the United States, who want to cross this brand new borderline and be in Mexico. And one is Mesilla, New Mexico, and one is Guadalupe, Chihuahua. Both of these are founded in 1850, 2 years after the war, by people who say, we want to remain in Mexico. Well, Mesilla, we know, is in the United States. So after people leave land that, as I say, they may have lived on for generations, they move in order to remain in Mexico, and they found the town of Mesilla, but it's in Chihuahua, and they start this new community, but it's in the territory that Mexico sells to the United States in 1853. So they uproot their lives to stay in Mexico, and 3 years later, the Mexican government sells the land to the United States. So there's this one generation that is very much affected by the creation of this brand new borderline. So to end this mini lecture about the border, we have to ask, where was the El Paso del Norte region officially located? For 200 years, El Paso del Norte, or Ciudad Juárez, had been part of Chihuahua, like it is today. But then during the time of the Santa Fe Trail, when traders that were becoming more and more powerful, they demanded that the El Paso del Norte region, which includes El Paso, Texas, which didn't exist yet, that this be part of New Mexico. So when Texas declares independence, and also when Texas is annexed by the United States, El Paso, Texas, or where El Paso, Texas is located now, is not in Texas. It's in New Mexico. In 1850, this area on the U.S. side is forced to become part of Texas. So I don't know if you've heard people say that we feel more like New Mexico than Texas. There's a historic reason for that feeling. So this area is actually in Chihuahua, then it's in New Mexico, then it's forced to be in Texas. So 1850, the town of Mesilla is founded. The town of Guadalupe is founded, again by people who want to remain in Mexico. And here where El Paso, Texas is located is forced to be part of Texas. So the town of San Elizario, that actually has its roots in the 1770s when a fort was built there, becomes the county seat when the county of El Paso was formed in 1850. And it's much bigger than any settlement here in what is now El Paso, Texas. And it's powerful, the people live there. But guess what changes everything? Something changes everything, and I'm going to show you on the next slide. The coming of the railroads changed everything. The railroads arrived in Juarez and El Paso in the 1880s. On the U.S. side of the border, the railroads bypass San Elizario and instead go to this tiny, tiny place of El Paso, Texas. And suddenly, El Paso becomes huge. It goes from a few hundred people to thousands of people after the coming of the railroad. But something else important happens. The United States builds railroads to the border, here through El Paso, and Mexico builds railroads north to Juarez, and the two link. So with the coming of the railroads, with the linking of the Mexican railroads and the U.S. railroads, El Paso and Juarez become very important to the economy of both nations. You have many things changing because now goods and products and people can move across the border, back and forth, easily through the railroads. So this is going to shift history, the coming of the railroads. So El Paso and Juarez go from being in a borderlands region to being divided by a border that is created by war and treaty and then reinforced through legislation and policy.